Perfect. Perfect.
This is Little Big Planet. Before Sony would captivate critics and audiences alike with its immensely revered and acclaimed Astrobot, these guys had another mascot that took the world by storm: Sackboy. Little Big Planet was a widely anticipated title with its emphasis on creativity, physics-based platforming, and the customizable factor of Sackboy himself, all contributing to the game's immense hype. When it did release, it was a critical darling and a commercial success, so much so that it went on to receive the award for Game of the Year. However, Little Big Planet's immense success didn't come without the occasional development hurdle, one of which led to the game being delayed to a few days after the initially advertised release date. See, in the level Swinging Safari, the original music that was to be utilized in it had originally contained musical segments that incorporated scripture from the Quran. Sounds fairly innocuous at a cursory glance, that is until you realize that implementing the Quran in a musical context was, at the time at least, actually considered offensive to Muslims. In fact, a Muslim playtester had actually pointed out the use of the Quran after listening to the music in the level. However, it gets even more controversial, because the lyrics in question had some fairly dark and macabre subject matter, with the English translation reading, "Every soul shall taste death, and all that is on earth will perish." Sony would promptly address the matter by delaying the game's release and recalling physical copies of the game that had already made their way to retailers. But contrary to popular belief, the choice was almost entirely predicated on the prospect of offending Muslims, and not due to the graphic and disturbing translated lyrics. However, that didn't stop some from getting their hands on the game before the initial first edition copies of the game were recalled, meaning that, if you were one of the lucky few who snagged the copy, congratulations, you now have an exceedingly rare collector's item that ranges in price from $200 to nearly $3,000 depending on the condition. After releasing a modified version of the game, Sony would eventually release a patch that completely eliminated all traces of the song, which would also apply to the recalled versions of the game. Though, granted, you could also just simply disable your internet connection and play the game without patching out the song. This is what I'm talking about today: games that were censored by their own developers after they were initially released. Enjoy!
How about we go bowling? I'm winning. Bring it up!
Oh, God of War, how I adore you as a video game franchise. As someone with a massive reverence and fascination for Greek mythology, God of War was a series that was already right up my alley. But in terms of execution, it's undeniably just as incredible as its core concept. It also helps that it's packed to the brim with eye-gouging, back-breaking, pulse-pounding, gratuitous violence that gets the blood pumping just as much as it gets spilt. Which is to say, an excessive amount. Hell, it even gave me a richer understanding of Greek mythology as a whole, which gave me a newfound sense of confidence when it came to talking to people about it, regardless of the outcome. I talked to my Greek boss the other day and asked him if he prays to Poseidon every time he's thankful for bottled water, and I'm still trying to figure out why he threw his office chair at me. But surprisingly, the God of War series, for all of its grisly violence, hasn't really been subjected to that much censorship on a widespread scale. I mean, yeah, it's banned in a handful of countries, and the coitus minigames that were once a staple of the series were criticized by some as profane and offensive, but besides that, it's not too terribly controversial. All I can say is thank God we're not playing as Zeus for that latter example, because if you know anything about Greek mythology, you know that Zeus committed so many vile acts that he sometimes makes P. Diddy look like a guy rational enough to accept no as an answer. That being said, there was one feature of a God of War game that became controversial enough to warrant a modification to its existence after the game had already been released. And believe it or not, it actually originates from a game that fans consider the black sheep of the franchise, God of War Ascension.
Your rage means nothing!
Look, to be honest, I never really understood the contempt directed towards God of War Ascension by hardcore fans. Sure, when compared to God of War 3, which released 3 years prior and is considered by many as the magnum opus of the series, it's lacking in some departments, but I think it's a pretty great hack-and-slash title that I believe is worthy of a critical reassessment by the fans. Now, in order to look at the censored content, we have to talk about the Furies, the main antagonists of the game. After overcoming the trials of Archimedes, Kratos is captured by a trio of winged ladies known as the Furies, who then proceed to imprison and torture him for an agonizing 3 weeks before Kratos breaks free of his shackles and is hell-bent on delivering some well-deserved retribution. What ensues is a frantic, blood-soaked pursuit of the Furies, which transpires all the way until the 19th chapter of the game. In it, we see Kratos duking it out with 2 of the 3 Furies, and surprise, surprise, Kratos emerges as the sole victor. However, if there's anyone that knows how to turn a tense battle into a grisly, vengeance-induced beatdown, it's Kratos, as the fight culminates with him delivering a brutally vicious series of curb stomps to one of the Furies' heads. Now, the violence itself wasn't the issue, at least not in isolation. It was the trophy notification that appeared on the top right corner of the screen that turned a few eyebrows. When the game first released, defeating the boss would originally bestow the player with a trophy titled Bros Before Hoes. To most, this was nothing more than a morbidly humorous and intentionally offensive joke that fit perfectly with the God of War series' sense of edge. I mean, let's be completely frank here. The God of War series might not have been on the same pedestal as Grand Theft Auto when it came to pure controversy, but it's not exactly supposed to be politically correct. Shortly after the game's release, there were a handful of people that viewed this intentionally offensive yet ultimately harmless achievement as if it was a goddamn war crime against humanity, with one notorious example coming from a guy by the name of Adam Sessler, who went so far as to lower his review score of the game due to an unlockable trophy. A fucking trophy. Is it vulgar? Yes. Is it darkly humorous? Also yes. And is it offensive? To a degree, I guess. But that's the whole point. It's not supposed to be taken seriously in any capacity, and if you ask me, I'd wager that most of the people who negatively reacted to this trophy viewed all of this out of context or were simply grossly misformed of the situation. Hey, post-edit C-shift here. It's actually not called Bros Before Hoes because of the curb stomp. No. It's actually titled that because Orkos over here saved Kratos out of a tough situation at the very last minute, even if it meant that he would not be in the sister's good graces anymore. So yes, it actually has nothing to do with the curb stomp, and has everything to do with him literally saving Kratos at the last minute. It was just a massive coincidence, meaning that it essentially sparked outrage for nothing. So yeah. The more you know. Now, in response to this, Santa Monica Studios, the developer of the game, responded by announcing that they would be modifying the achievement and renaming it to Bros Before Foes, to negate any potential animosity or criticism in the future. And fans of the series were quite disgruntled at the news. You wanna know the funniest part about all this? In that same announcement, Santa Monica Studios had revealed that it was actually a woman on the development team that conceived the idea of naming the trophy Bros Before Hoes, which is a pretty clear-cut stomp on the head to the critics that tried to erroneously label this game as misogynistic. Despite this controversy, the God of War series would continue to flourish in subsequent years, as the Norse-era games, God of War and God of War Ragnarok, would push the series in a new direction and rekindle interest in the franchise. Despite how much I love both of these games, however, I do sometimes lament the loss of the series' edgy and comedically macabre humor, but with an alleged remake of the first 3 mainline God of War games apparently undergoing development, we might be able to revisit those glory days once more. Alright, so now I get to talk about a game that I haven't even had the chance to include on a list before. But hey, miracles happen, I guess. I'm talking about Dead by Daylight, the game with a community that has the emotional fluctuations of a puberty-riddled teenager.
A few moments later.
This is really shitty. This is like some stinky garbage that you're putting out here. I really don't like it. I don't respect it at all.
It's one of those games that avid players tend to have a bit of a love-hate relationship with, just minus the oily, anger-induced breakup sex and the imminent divorce papers. One minute, they're giving it enough verbal fellatio to put both the local brothel and the slam poetry club out of business. And the next thing you know, they're releasing 45-minute rants about how the development team inadvertently introduced a new 3-gen slug meta. I don't even think that's a real thing. I'm just basing this off of the bizarre Dead by Daylight jargon that the community uses when I watch a DVD tier list video. Now, the first couple of months of Dead by Daylight's post-release support were, well, rocky, to say the least. It had a severely bare-bones and minimal roster of characters to choose from, balance that was about as existent as my deadbeat sperm donor of a biological father, get fucked, John, and perks that range from absurdly overpowered to so impractical it's almost depressing tier, that even pre-Shippuden-era Sakura seems like a competent fighter in comparison. That being said, there was one crucial moment that, in my opinion at least, ultimately paved the way for the longevity of the game's lifespan, the advent of licensed characters. It all began in October of 2016, when the upcoming killer at the time was revealed to be none other than Michael Myers of the Halloween franchise, who would also be bundled with his own map, Lampkin Lane, and an accompanying survivor, one of the most prominent final girls in horror movie history, Laurie Strode. It was kind of a watershed moment for Dead by Daylight's history, and it opened the floodgates to potential future licenses. Well, the developers would eventually continue this trend just under a year later, when another horror movie icon made his arrival to the game's ever-growing roster, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. However, unlike Michael Myers' ambitious debut, poor Leatherface Leatherface landed with a bit of a thud, so to speak, as it was blatantly obvious from the get-go that his inclusion was a bit more, shall I say, hastily cobbled together. Instead of his own map in Survivor, you were only given Leatherface. His ability was lackluster, to put it lightly, as he was essentially a poor man's hillbilly with a less effective chainsaw sweep, and hell, he even shared the exact same perks as the aforementioned character, and he was just so unbearably generic in the grand scheme of the game's roster. However, most of the issues would be rectified in subsequent updates, as he would eventually be given more distinguishing factors, a chainsaw sweep that felt significantly different from the hillbilly's chainsaw dash, and even his own suite of original perks. However, all of these changes would, unfortunately, come with a caveat, as there was a relatively unique feature that Leatherface was equipped with in the early days of his release that was sadly removed from the game due to a few less than savory actors at play. See, Leatherface is the crafty one in his cannibalistic, possibly inbred family, as he utilizes every individual component of a victim's body for a variety of uses, but he predominantly uses his victims to forge makeshift face masks. This is easily one of Leatherface's most iconic and simultaneously revolting attributes, and it's one that the developers actually implemented into the game, albeit temporarily. If you played Leatherface and scored a set number of kills on each of the first 4 survivors of the game, you would actually be bestowed with 4 stomach-churning gifts as testaments to your hard work. You were able to unlock face masks that resembled Dwight, Meg, Claudette, and Jake. Not only were these effectively a free set of bonus cosmetics for Leatherface, but they concurrently served as bragging rights rewards, as they proudly displayed your grotesque achievements in all of their leathery glory. However, over time, there were a few players that decided to utilize one of these masks in a bit of an unorthodox manner, which led to the untimely removal of the masks as a whole. See, one of the survivor masks that you could unlock resembled Claudette, and a handful of players had opted to utilize this mask as a means of alluding to blackface, while simultaneously going out of their way to aggressively harass other players while donning the mask. Ultimately, this led to the developers issuing a patch that would outright remove all of the masks in the game, even if you had already unlocked them prior to deletion. As compensation, the developers issued 6,000 iridescent shards to the players that had previously unlocked said masks. Needless to say, the community had a very polarizing response to this outcome. Some were supportive of the decision to remove the masks in order to preemptively halt any and all potential attempts of harassment in the future, but others were far more critical of the decision. Most players argued that the removal of a player's hard-earned cosmetic item was already crossing the line, and others argued that removing the masks ultimately hindered the fan service potential of Leatherface's inclusion in the game, as it aligned perfectly with his character. Hell, there were even some that argued that using the face masks actually boosted Leatherface's stealth potential, as a couple of the face masks actually exhibited a darker shade of skin than Leatherface's original mask. I don't know, it's a bit difficult to attempt a stealth build with this guy when he's a lumbering brute with a rumbling chainsaw and a propensity to have a violent conniption every time he collides with a wall, but then again, this is a stealth kill in Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. So what the fuck do I know about playstyles and game design? Personally, I feel like the removal of the face masks was ultimately a poor decision, because they added to Leatherface's character tremendously, and if harassment was the primary issue at hand, they could have tracked down the bad actors, banned them into the fucking stratosphere,
And pull it up.
and what do you know, you now have a system that rewards a vast majority of the fan base that plays by the rules while punishing the minority. Hey, wait, that's the wrong minority! Of course, this isn't the first or last time that a particular feature was removed in Dead by Daylight after release, but it's arguably one of the most notorious examples in the game's equally controversial post-release alterations. Fancy a little Tokyo Ghoul, anyone? Ah, Mario Kart. You really can't go wrong with Mario Kart until you can when the newest entry borders on $100, but I digress. The Mario Kart series, shockingly enough, is no stranger to the realm of eyebrow-raising content, with both negative and positive connotations. There's that now iconic meme where Luigi gives a disgruntled glance at his foe for presumably nearly sideswiping him before moving on with his day and happily steering off into the sunset. It's farcical and somewhat wholesome to an extent, and I thought the same outcome would apply to real life. Next thing you know, this guy with a mustache and a 10-gallon hat tells me to pull to the side of the road, passes me a slip of paper with a phone number and an address, and says that I have a court date. Yeah, no thanks, I'm taken. I don't roll that way, buddy. But then you have Mario Kart World, a game that practically oozes the word controversy with its small but significant alterations to the Mario Kart formula, its egregious $80 price tag, and the most irredeemable quality of them all, at least according to PETA, the playable cow having a fucking nose ring, because regular cows, they're all fine and dandy until you give them a septum piercing, a penchant for My Chemical Romance, and daddy issues. However, the censored post-release content that we're talking about today actually stems from the most lauded and financially lucrative title in the franchise, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. I love this game. It's my favorite Mario Kart game by a long shot, and seeing the chaotic outcomes and significant uptick in divorce rates occur right in front of me because of a last-minute blue shell Hail Mary is certainly not a joy to deal with in the heat of the moment, but good God almighty, it certainly prevents Thanksgiving from being an absolute snooze fest, I'll tell you that. Now, what really helped Mario Kart 8 distinguish itself from the other entries was its abundance of guest characters from other Nintendo properties. It certainly wasn't the first to do it, as the likes of Pac-Man, his wife, which may or may not be a cover-up for his passion in drag racing, and even Nintendo's own Rob had already established the crossover potential of Mario Kart, but it was this entry that cemented the idea in the best fashion, if you ask me. Link from The Legend of Zelda, the villagers from Animal Crossing, even the fucking Miis were itching for a chance to take part in the Mushroom Cup. The fucking Miis! However, for the sake of this video, we're going to be fixating on the inclusion of Splatoon characters. You have a wide variety of options to choose from in terms of design, but we have to specifically choose the female Inkling. Now, whenever you toss an item at your opponent and it connects, your character will perform a split-second celebratory animation that indicates that you successfully hit your target. Simple enough. Well, whenever the characters were first introduced in an update, the female Inkling initially had a celebration gesture that saw her pumping her fist while flexing her arm, similar to how one would proudly display their muscles after pulling off an impressive bench lift. As to the origin of this particular animation, well, there's no definitive or concrete answer, but most believe that this pose was implemented as a nod to the iconic Rosie the Riveter, while others speculated that this actually stemmed from a similar gesture utilized in Japan that was meant as a means of touting the magnitude of your biceps and implying that your opponent was comparatively frail. Sounds relatively innocuous in the grand scheme of things. Well, Nintendo quickly ushered in a patch that would completely modify the female Inkling's gesture. And why, you may ask? Because this specific gesture is actually viewed as highly offensive and associated with vulgarity in certain regions of the world. In European countries, for example, this gesture is identified as the brach de honneur. I don't know how to speak French, and can be likened to the good old-fashioned method of jutting out nothing but your middle finger, like a lawyer adjusting his glasses, or a veterinarian reconsidering his career path as he's forced to perform a rectal exam on a hamster. Or, if you want me to go into layman's terms, it essentially means fuck you. Regardless, this specific animation was altered in the game's 1.1 patch, which now sees the Inkling girl performing a generic celebratory animation that completely removes any trace of the original gesture. Oh boy, The Last of Us. If you're even relatively familiar with the games that released during the 2010s, you are more than likely familiar with the unanimously acclaimed and groundbreaking story of The Last of Us. It was developer Naughty Dog's first major foray into a far more grounded and realistic approach to storytelling, as opposed to the slapstick, cartoon-adjacent escapades of Crash Bandicoot or Jak and Daxter, or the climactic Indiana Jones-esque Uncharted series. And boy oh boy did these guys deliver. The Last of Us is considered by many as a true work of art in the realm of video games, and helped firmly cement the notion of video games being considered as an art form. Its narrative was revered as a masterclass in storytelling, its graphics at the time were pushing the PlayStation 3 to its absolute limits, and the gameplay was a tense and brutal amalgamation of action, survival horror, and stealth. It set a new, very imposing benchmark for any and all subsequent attempts at forging video game narratives, and to this day, many consider The Last of Us as a pioneer in the more linear, story-driven approach that many games adopted after this game's release. Now, that being said, you may be surprised to know that The Last of Us actually faced a myriad of pre- and post-release fiascos that, for a fleeting moment, left Naughty Dog embroiled in some pretty peculiar controversies. However, the one we're talking about today is a rather humorous oversight that actually yielded some real-world ramifications, though granted, they weren't that catastrophic in the grand scheme of things. In order to discuss this particular issue, however, we have to talk about the ostensibly mundane concept of the phone number. See, video games have had a very unique history with implementing phone numbers. There's that god-awful Who Framed Roger Rabbit game that saw the player dialing a real-world phone number in order to get a message from Jessica Rabbit that would aid said player in completing the game. Then there's the Grand Theft Auto series, with the two most recent mainline entries allowing the player to dial a fictional phone number with the provided in-game phone in order to receive a vast array of covert messages. Regardless, both of these examples implemented phone numbers in order to achieve one distinct goal: immersion. But then there's The Last of Us, a game that essentially consolidated the two ideas, though the intention certainly didn't equate to Naughty Dog's expected outcome. See, throughout the course of the game, you'll find a multitude of posters sporadically scattered throughout the world, and some of these particular posters had phone numbers plastered on them. However, the one in particular that I'm referring to is this poster that proudly advertises a pest control service. Now, if you were a player that stumbled upon this when the game first released, what would you do? There's nobody giving you a gentle nudge on the shoulder and telling you to give it a call. There's not an option to bust out a phone in-game because A, you're in the middle of a fucking global apocalypse. I'm sure Reddit karma doesn't take high precedence on your survival list, unless you're a moderator for r/politics. And B, this isn't GTA unless we're talking about the most recent entry in both of these franchises, because because in both scenarios, I end up in a rage-induced frenzy every time the notion of an in-game golf session enters my headspace. I'll stick with competitive shooting, I guess. Oh, fuck! So clearly this must be some sort of obscure, under-the-radar Easter egg, right? Well, if you were to call one of these numbers, you would actually end up coming into contact with a sex hotline, because even in the apocalypse, you can bet your bottom dollar that a sex-starved gooner is willing to crank one out, even if it means paying someone else's rent.
Beat my fucking meat right here with no mask on, and you can't stop me.
Yes, a fictional pest control service's phone number coincidentally shared the exact same digits as a real-life sex hotline. I don't even have a good joke for this one. Actually, that's a lie. It's called The Last of Us Part 2 storyline. So how did an oversight of this magnitude manage to slip through the cracks? Well, the developers themselves actually responded to this, and the explanation is actually quite humorous, all things considered. See, the rationale here was that the digits 555 were actually used in an abundance of films in order to create fictional phone numbers, as the aforementioned digits, when placed in the middle of the phone number, are actually reserved for usage in films, books, and other forms of media. By utilizing the 555 phone number, the developers were under the impression that they had effectively forged a fake number, and tossed it into the final game without even a modicum of testing. The problem is the team didn't recognize that there are some exceptions to this rule, such as the fact that it doesn't apply to toll-free numbers, which the team did implement by way of using the 800 prefix, though granted this was nothing more than a fortuitous blunder. Roughly a month after the game's release, Naughty Dog issued a patch that removed the phone numbers, but in a clever twist, they actually added a bit of environmental detail by making it seem like someone or something tampered with the advertisement. However, you can still find this phone number if you have the original PlayStation 3 version of the game and prevent it from updating to the 1.02 patch. Though whether the phone number is still in effect or not, well, to be frank, I'm not really sure. I don't intend to find out. Okay, so when you think of Spider-Man in the contemporary era, what do you think of? You think of the incredible Spider-Man titles created by Insomniac Games, the cinematic portrayal of the character played by Tom Holland.
Nice job, kid.
Thanks.
Or you might even think of the Spider-Verse films that helped popularize the Miles Morales version of Spider-Man to general audiences. However, if you were a kid like me in the 2000s, you associated Spider-Man with three things: Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi, and the trilogy of films that the former starred in and the director helmed. And also Andrew Garfield in the Amazing Spider-Man films. But let's be honest, that first one was great, but the second one sucked more fat dick than a jaded hooker wanting to push her gag reflexes to the max. Naturally, the successes of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films would breed a massive influx of Spider-Man-themed video games, with the one I'm referring to on this list being Spider-Man, the movie tie-in game made to coincide with the 2002 big screen debut of the titular character. Now, while most obviously prefer the more ambitious open-world Spider-Man 2 and the Insomniac Spider-Man titles, 2002's Spider-Man was still a pretty banging outing, and prior to the subsequent releases, truly was the definitive Spider-Man experience. So at the end of the game, Spider-Man celebrates a triumphant victory against the Green Goblin by engaging in a passionate kiss with his red-haired love interest, Mary Jane Watson. It's heroic, it's romantic, and it's enough to make the average gooner unleash muffled cries into his pillow as he laments never being touched by a woman unless he smears lipstick on his right hand and names it Sheila. However, for some, this simply wasn't enough. Oh, no. We gotta crank it up a notch by cheating. Oh, get the fuck out of here. When the game was originally released, there was a cheat code that allowed you to swap out Spider-Man's character model and replace it with Mary Jane's character model. It sounds silly and pretty innocuous. That is until you realize that this model swap doesn't just affect gameplay, but in-game cutscenes as well. You can probably already tell where this is going. If you kept this cheat enabled on the final mission, you'd be bestowed with the image of Mary Jane passionately kissing herself like the pretentious, egotistical bitch that she is. Although this was a relatively humorous sight, this was still enough to cause a bit of eyebrows to raise, as it was a clear-cut, albeit unintentional display of a lesbian kiss. The developers would eventually respond to this by issuing a revised copy of the game that didn't just remove the scene, but the cheat code as well, meaning that there were no legitimate or plausible means of getting Mary Jane to kiss a carbon copy of herself. Why was this? Well, the concept of a same-sex kiss in a video game, while not exactly a foreign concept, was still something that had not been prevalent enough in the medium, and so it was removed in updated copies of the game. What's funny about this particular alteration was that it reportedly led to the Mary Jane cheat code and kiss scene becoming somewhat of an urban legend in the video game community, as, like I mentioned earlier, not all copies of the game contained the cheat code. The players with the updated copies were befuddled beyond belief when they were told that a cheat code could let you play as Mary Jane, despite the fact that their own copy of the game completely contradicted that statement. And as for the players with the original copies that were trying to convince the revised copy player base that there was in fact a Mary Jane cheat code in the game, well, it was like attempting to teach the average person above 70 how to operate an iPhone. It was a lost cause, and it more than likely ended with a pat on the back, a defeated expression, and the confused party being told, "You'll figure it out someday, Barnaby." However, Mary Jane has since been redeemed, maybe a little bit too much according to some, in the contemporary era of Spider-Man video games, as she's given a taser that can single-handedly depopulate an entire militia of enemies with a few well-timed shocks and some convenient plot armor. God only knows what she'll be capable of in Spider-Man 3. Now, if you thought we were done talking about Nintendo, think again, because we're now talking about one of gaming's most impressive slam dunks in the fighting game genre, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is, for me at least, undoubtedly the apex of the Super Smash Bros. Series. It feels precise and fluid, contains every single Smash Bros. Character up to that point and then some, and to me at least feels like the quintessential celebration of gaming as a medium. However, despite all of Smash Ultimate's exceptional merits, there were a few that were less impressed with Nintendo's approach to eradicate any and all traces of anything that could even be remotely deemed as taboo. For example, take Snake. Back in Brawl, this guy was packing up enough cake to put Wario and the average volleyball player out of business. Then you fast forward to Ultimate, and his ass was nerfed so aggressively that it makes Game & Watch look more filled out than Augustus Gloop in comparison. However, in order to talk about the subject of this video, we have to rewind to the year of 2020. See, Smash Ultimate had a wave of post-release content that generated unprecedented degrees of hype, largely because of the abundance of new characters that ranged from long-awaited by the fans to so audacious and outlandish that it actually kinda worked. And then there's Byleth. Poor guy stood as much of a chance against the agitated crowd of fans as I do at a multi-day marathon. I'm many things, but the Forrest Gump of endurance I am not. However, one of the most unexpected yet simultaneously lauded additions was none other than Steve from Minecraft, and thankfully his inclusion was handled with immense care and meticulous attention to detail. This game was helmed by Masahiro Sakurai after all. The man doesn't disappoint when it comes to these things. However, when Steve first released, there was one highly specific animation that eventually led to him being censored in a subsequent patch. See, in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, each character is granted 3 different victory animations that are performed after securing a victory against your opponent, and naturally, Steve was no different. However, one of these particular animations saw Steve indulging in a succulent piece of meat before presumably becoming satiated with his snack and standing still. However, the final resting pose culminated in Steve proudly holding his aforementioned piece of meat in a manner that, for some, came off as a little salacious. All I can say is thank God this didn't happen in public, or the creepers wouldn't be the only sentient being in Minecraft given that unfortunate namesake. Yes, the internet did what it did best and took a relatively harmless victory animation and provided some rather lewd connotations to it. For some, this was a shocking and downright baffling oversight that could very easily be interpreted as a joke of the phallic variety, while others found this to be nothing more than a harmless victory animation that was shrouded in infamy due to a multitude of users that, well, let's just say had some rather tainted lines of thinking. Regardless of how you felt, this was one of Smash Ultimate's most viral sensations, and that should tell you something considering that this was the same game that introduced Banjo-Kazooie, Sephiroth, and even Sora as newcomers. We got fucking Disney in Smash Bros. Before GTA 6, let that sink in. Regardless, whenever the next patch rolled around, Steve was unfortunately nerfed, not from a gameplay perspective, oh no, but from a cosmetic one, let's say, as his victory animation was modified to include one notable change. Steve would no longer indefinitely carry his meat after eating it. You wanna know the funniest part? I'd wager that if no one made sexual implications regarding this particular animation, this would probably still be in the game, but alas, such an outcome would not come to fruition. There is, however, a silver lining to all the Steve players out there, as he's still considered the single most potent character in the game from a competitive standpoint. But even that comes with a caveat, as you'd be hard-pressed to find a tournament where this guy isn't banned from competitive play. Poor guy can't catch a break, can he? Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna be a bit busy cleaning out my fridge because of the copious amounts of leftover Thanksgiving food that I still haven't finished eating. In the meantime, C-Sim, start that fireplace, throw on some Home Alone, and while you're at it, crank up the radio because damn it, we're listening to some Christmas tunes. Next one. One more time. Oh god fucking damn it, Mariah!